Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the webinar that we're running on optimizing international student recruitment in Nigeria today. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Zoe Marlowe. I'm the Head of Client Relations for our Education Division, and I'm going to be moderating and managing our conversation, our discussion today. And this is a picture of my first interaction with West Africa. It's not Nigeria, actually. It's Senegal, my first ever job. And this is now 20 years ago, and a celebration of my great affection for West Africa as a really, really important destination for all of us in the business. I'm joined today by a colleague who's equally experienced in West Africa, my colleague Stuart Rennie. You can see him in action here in Nigeria. And Stuart, perhaps I can ask you to introduce yourself and a quick summary of your work.
Thank you, Zoe, and great to be speaking to everyone today about West Africa, one of my favourite destinations to work in and also to recruit students from as well. Like Zoe, I've been working in West Africa in the business for 20 years. It all started working at a university in Scotland that was engaged in oil and gas. And from there, I began to specialise in working in Nigeria, building up my expertise, working with schools, colleges, universities, agents, and also the government bodies. I've been head and director of various international offices in universities in the UK, and I set up my own company 6 years ago, focusing specifically on Africa with a real focus on Nigeria to strategically help schools, colleges, and universities gain a footprint in the important market of Nigeria.
Okay, that's great. Thanks so much. And Stuart, we have invited you to speak today because you relatively recently started working with a Canadian institution and you're guiding them through their next steps in Nigeria. I just thought it would be useful for people on the call to have an idea of what prompted them to start working with you, and you know, so that people can get in their minds some of the drivers that they may be contending with, in case there's some things that sound familiar.
Sure, absolutely. So we're delighted to be working with a large metropolitan university in Canada, and they approached us early on last year because they had seen a spike in applications from Nigeria. They were also very keen to diversify the markets that they were working in. They had done a lot of work in India, they had done a lot of work in China, but they didn't quite know how to get into the African market. And they were very clear by looking at the numbers in Nigeria, by looking at the demographics, especially in the age range 18 to 22, and looking just at the economic drivers in Nigeria, that Nigeria was a market that they had to engage in. They felt very removed from the market, they hadn't really been to the market, they didn't know the network, so they had to find someone that could give them that entry and bring them into the market to show them the opportunities, and more importantly, Zoe, to help set up that infrastructure and network without them having to do it from a remote point of view.
Yeah, okay. Well, it's that necessity of getting closer to the market. And I think understanding some of the cultural aspects as well as the practical aspects is going to be one of the elements which is around optimizing student recruitment in Nigeria. So we'll come back to that. Some of those drivers may feel familiar. In terms of the webinar today, it's a very straightforward structure, actually. We're just going to do a very, very quick run through where Stuart will update people having just got back from Nigeria in the last few days. Just a quick rundown of the political, economic, social and technological aspects of the country. So just a quick test framework. And then we're going to just run through a classic marketing framework as well. So the 7 Ps and how that actually works. I guess important to say, first of all, that we really welcome your questions. And you can see there's a chat box there in the bottom left-hand corner. Please do pop a question in there for us, and I'll send that out to Stuart, and he'll take those at the end. And also just to say that the webinar will be recorded so that you can share with other colleagues. Okay, so as a market, obviously Nigeria in the US really a big player. Just looking at Open Doors data, I was really struck, as I always am when I look at these numbers, to see the strength of the increases, up 12% on last year now, breaking through 10,000 students, half of them undergraduates. So obviously an undergraduate student just being so much more valuable from a repeat tuition fee perspective. And also just thinking that there's plenty of opportunity there for that to continue. But maybe, Stuart, you could just give us a kind of a starting point on what is driving that sustained growth in Nigeria.
Sure, and it's a really good question. I mean, one of the fundamentals there is that they just have a complete lack of higher education provision. The money has not been put into HE. There is a lack of universities, both public and private. And if you also go back to my earlier point, Zoe, about the increase in the demographics, the population, especially in that bracket that we're targeting, the 18 to 22s, it's going to be in one of the top 5 countries by 2025. So the capacity means that students have to look overseas from Nigeria. There's also the lack of trust in the system, and parents and students are becoming very frustrated by strikes in Nigeria, by the potential of them not being able to complete their course in the required time. So they're nervous about not getting a final degree. And they also value international education. But here's the important point, Zoe, that over the past 10 years, the UK was always seen as the go-to destination. What has changed significantly in the past 2 to 3 years is that students are far more savvy in their choices. They're beginning to look at the US, and we can see that with the growing numbers from Open Doors. They're beginning to look at Canada. They're looking for opportunities not just to study, but what that overall qualification will lead to. And more importantly, they want to know that the degree or graduate studies that they do will lead to good quality employment. So it's a far more complicated choice now for a Nigerian student than it maybe was in the past. And that's good news for our colleagues who are on the webinar today.
Right, no, definitely. And I guess, you know, as the word of mouth spreads about the academic experience in North America, then there's no reason to imagine that is not going to continue, right? I mean, logically, you know, as people graduate and see that their course and their experience has prepared them for meaningful employment, then that should still continue in the future.
Yeah, and that's absolutely right. I mean, one of the biggest drivers in Nigeria is word of mouth. Families are a huge thing, and they rely on the experiences of other family members, whether they're working in North America or whether they have studied there. And yes, they will use ranking tools, they'll look at websites, they'll have a look at what the university is saying about itself, but more importantly, they will ask from experience from friends and family how that particular student got on in the US or in Canada and what type of job they're doing now. So alumni profiles and keeping on top of where your students end up working and the type of jobs they do is going to be a critical part of the strategy. So alumni are a key part of it.
Yeah, I'm always struck by actually how often alumni are a key part of international strategy, or should be, but quite often never just can just sometimes not really quite seem to come together, which is always a regret. But anyway, okay, so the numbers are good and we feel very positive. So we, Stuart and I ran a version of this webinar about 6 months ago, and we looked at Nigeria alongside some of the other emergent African markets, and we found that a structured framework like a political, economic, social and technological framework was a very useful way of framing what was going on. As I said, Stuart spends almost as much time in Nigeria as he does at home in Scotland and is just back from the market. So I thought it would be really good just for literally a few minutes just have a quick update on what the political, economic, social and technological dimensions are and how they've changed. So now the President Buhari has been in power for 2 years. It was a very notable win for him because it was the first time in the history of Nigeria that an incumbent president lost to an opposition candidate in a general election. And Buhari's, one of his main thrusts was an anti-corruption platform, but perhaps because of that, it was very slow, Stuart, I remember, for him to get some of the key ministers in place, and it was the whole sort of sense was that it was a slow start. What's the situation on that now politically? Where is the country?
Yeah, I mean, it was, so I think that's absolutely right. As the president and his party took power, he took a long time to make key appointments in the cabinet, and as a result of that, it meant that the budget didn't get passed, which in essence meant the economy stalled. So there was no money out to scholarship bodies, there was no money out to the key ministries, and what that then meant was that people were not confident about making the decisions. They didn't know where the country was going economically. Anyway, fast forward a year, he got the cabinet in place. However, he inherited a country that was effectively bust because of corruption in the last government and not monitoring the governance and the stem and flow of money. So that, coupled with the falling price of oil, falling back to about $50 a barrel and below at points, had a real impact and actually threw Nigeria into a recession, which was experienced last year. And that recession then meant there was a real struggle on forex, so actually getting money in and out of the country. So that had an impact last year on students who were making decisions to study overseas, and unless they had friends or family who had an overseas dollar account, it was almost impossible for them to pay their fees. And I think the vice president, who has had to stand in, and he has had to stand in now over the past year because Buhari has actually been pretty ill. He's not released information on why he's been ill, but the vice president has got a very strong economic background. He's popular in the business community in Nigeria, and he's actually put in some pretty smart policies. He's reversed the forex policy, which has meant that this year we're in a completely different place to where we were last year. Students, sponsors, parents can now access the money through their banks. And the word on the ground from my last trip, speaking to agents, speaking to the banks, speaking to sponsors, that the money is flowing this year. So we're seeing applications up. But more importantly, and the crucial point for conversion, is that we're seeing that the deposits are being made, the banks are releasing the forex, which is breeding confidence for parents and sponsors. So this year, things are certainly looking to go in the right direction. The only caveat I would put in place there is that if anything was to happen to President Buhari, that could stall the economy or it could change things at short notice. But at the moment, it looks as though Nigeria is going to pull itself out of recession this year, and it's being led, albeit by the vice president. He's seen as being a very capable pair of hands.
Interesting. Always great to have a really strong second in command, I guess, in that sense. And you just mentioned, some of the economic factors. I was just going to kind of move on to that really and just say that, of course, we're always used to thinking of Nigeria as being heavily dependent on oil and gas. The source of, what would you say, about 90% of export earnings and probably about 70% of government revenues at a certain point. Is that still the situation? There still is that dependence on oil, and the oil price has recovered somewhat?
Yeah, I mean, it is so. And I was looking at the oil price this morning, and the oil price had just dipped under $50 a barrel, currently sitting about 48. But what is important here, and I think certainly for clients on the call today, is to actually look at the exchange rates as well. So if we look at the forex against the dollar, at the moment, it's $315 to the naira. Now, last year, when there was a major problem, that was spiking at 350, which meant that overseas education was becoming more and more expensive. So yes, they're still reliant on oil, but they've put in place this February an economic recovery plan that was released alongside when they changed the rules around forex. And they're very aware that to be a successful, stable economy and to be the key driver, as they are, in Africa at the moment, they need to diversify. So they're going to, yes, focus on oil and gas, but beginning to look at refining their own oil and gas rather than sending it out of the country. Also, there will be a focus on agriculture. There will be a focus on infrastructure and construction, major projects required around building of airports, building of highways. There will be a focus on health and the sciences around that. Biomedical, for example, nursing is going to become important. But construction, transportation, logistics, agriculture, telecommunications, IT are going to be a real focus for the current government.
Brilliant. Well, sounds really promising. If any of our university partners and friends on call today have logistics, construction or other infrastructure-related courses, great potential in that respect. Just
Absolutely.
to quickly move on to the social factor. Obviously, it's a youthful population, a very youthful population, a growing one. But I'm sure that I read somewhere very recently a sense that graduates have unrealistic expectations of the job they're going to get when they actually graduate. Any thoughts on that?
Yes, I mean, this is a critical area for Nigeria, Zoe, and this actually shows that the lack of investment in higher education, particularly in the soft skills and the industry-ready skills, is having a massive impact on today's graduates in Nigeria. Now, what the major companies are telling me, companies like Total, Chevron, KPMG, the professional services, that graduates are coming out in Nigeria, but they do not have the work-ready skills. So this is a real opportunity for clients on the call today to think about the courses you offer in your institutions, but the courses where there are internships or co-ops in Canada, where those students can pick up industry experience. So when they graduate, whether it's undergraduate or graduate studies, they'll have those skills to be able to go back to Nigeria and put themselves in a strong position for employers, which Nigerian graduates at the moment, graduating in country, just do not have.
Just don't have, exactly. I was reading a piece, it was an opinion piece, and it was like, you know, you've got your BSc in biology or whatever, now what are you going to do? You're going to show it to the employer, and they're going to be like, right, great. So what can you actually do? So yeah, that's so maybe some potential there around experiential education or some softer skills training. Okay, and the last thing I just wanted to quickly look at was the state of technology, because Nigeria is one of those markets where mobile has really kind of leapfrogged some of the fixed line broadband. 78% mobile phone penetration is obviously absolutely immense. So how, in terms of a university looking to work in Nigeria, what are the implications of that?
So this is really important. I mean, fixed broadband bypassed Nigeria because they never had a network that was going to be able to carry it. So there's been a huge penetration from local Nigerian companies and companies from the Middle East, Etisalat, for example, investing in the IT and mobile structure in Nigeria. And that's how Nigerians do business, whether it's the local farmer selling his produce or whether it's a student looking to make their choices to university. So the digital piece alongside the traditional piece for student recruitment is really important. The problem is if you need to know what these sites are, whether it's My Edu Nigeria, whether it's the Students Forum NG, myschool.com, whether it's the Linda Akeja blog, whether it's looking at investing through Eski or Togo, there's various options. Now, from experience, there are a lot of digital agencies in the UK, in the US, and Canada who say they will be able to access a campaign for universities. But from experience, I can see that they do not have the right contacts. They don't have the local on-the-ground presence or an agent who can deliver it for him. So it's really important to have that local person on the ground, whether that's strategic consultants like ourselves, whether it's a good quality agent, or whether it's running your own operation out there. You need to be engaged in the digital piece, the mobile piece, and also the social media piece. It's all integrated. It needs to be a clear part of the strategy. Hello?
Hi, everybody. Sorry about that. I just was disconnected momentarily. Stuart, are you still with us?
I'm still here, yes?
Okay, great. Perfect. So I think that probably wraps up the first section and a general sense of improvement in positive sentiment in the country. So time for us to really move on and look at optimizing your spend. And I guess it's really, the question is if having heard the general kind of positive direction of travel in Nigeria, really just thinking about what is the optimum campaign approach, and where would you start with that in terms of optimizing your approach, your investment, Stuart?
So there's different ways of looking at it, but for clients who are looking to really engage, and I would imagine a lot of people on the call today are kind of looking at the kind of first steps into Nigeria. To optimize that, there's a number of things we need to look at, Zoe. We need to look at what the target market is. And for example, my client that I work with in Canada, their driver was the undergraduate market. So we needed to then pin that down to say, where are the students coming from that they've got at the moment? So the target was to look at a number of the international schools across Nigeria, which there are a number, including American, British, Canadian, French, Indian schools. So that was one of the key target pieces. We also targeted some of the leading private schools that cover the Nigerian WIAC qualification. And their driver was, at the university we work with, that they're looking at quality grades. So we're not looking at students who have got low quality grades, but we also have a scholarship piece in there as well, so students who had good grades. So there was the school piece, which means getting in with school counsellors. We've obviously developed a network of relationships with those over the years. It was also very clear that they had no real relationship with student recruitment agents. And the agency piece is a big piece in Nigeria, especially when we're talking about assisting students with visas. So we developed an integrated agent strategy for them, with agents in the Tier 1 cities of Lagos, Abuja, but also getting out to the other Tier 2 cities where there is money, where there is a lot of support and commitment, but you do not necessarily get a lot of universities visiting, places like Port Harcourt, Uyo, Benin City, and Nugu. And these are places that we can travel to. So there was that piece, but there then was also the time scale and the time frame, looking at the visa. Now, the visa to somewhere like Canada, the study permit, can take up to 3 months. So that straight away means that you need to align your pipeline for the fall intake to ensure that you have students in at an early stage. So visiting the market in September, October, January, and making sure that students are tied in before they do their exams as well.
Okay. All right. So let's say, for example, that we've got a budget of $20,000 US look to invest in the Nigerian market over a period of 12 months. And the fundamental goal is to increase the footprint, grow the numbers, and build out more contacts on the ground in order to achieve sustainable growth over a period of time. If we look at the 7 Ps, the classic 7 Ps of marketing, can I just run you through those, Stuart, and you can just sort of give me some quick thoughts on what would be the best use of $20,000 US to build out your numbers in Nigeria. Okay, so first of all, obviously we've got to start with the product and the key courses. You've already alluded to some of them previously.
Yeah, so the key courses, I mean, it's very clear in Nigeria. We're talking about business and anything related to business. What is becoming clear is, though, that Nigeria is becoming more specialised when they think about business. So they are beginning to look at logistics, purchasing supply, human resource management, data analytics, engineering, right across the board, whether that's mechanical, electronic and electrical, obviously oil and gas, power engineering, power becoming a key driver for the economy, IT, data security, big areas in the health, biomedical sciences, nursing, oil and gas, asset management, architecture, construction, finance, going to be the key kind of drivers.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is that there's a range of courses, but there are, as the market evolves and matures, there is going to be the opportunity for more niche courses to be developed, yes?
There is, and we're seeing more and more of that, Zoe. I mean, kind of 8 years ago, they were looking at general, but it's absolutely focusing in on specific niches in certain areas now.
Okay, nice. All right, perfect. So that is a point to bear in mind then on the course front or the product front. In terms of promoting those courses, I mean, I guess the classic kind of division is face-to-face versus digital. And when we look at the kind of use of mobile that we talked about earlier, I presume that a good chunk of my 20,000 will be invested in digital campaigns, yeah? Would that be the case?
A good chunk of it would be invested in digital, Zoe, but what I would also put in here as a caveat, and this is so important in Nigeria, that people work on a face-to-face basis. So with any of these courses, and let's just pick engineering, for example, if we wanted to promote some of the engineering programs, yes, you would be using a digital campaign to target these programs, but you would also be engaging with any of the companies in Nigeria who are focusing on engineering, whether that was oil and gas companies. You would also be approaching the professional bodies in Nigeria that accredit engineering programs. Yeah. And you would be making sure that you were zoning in on schools that were delivering strong STEM subjects, and likewise universities that were delivering strong engineering programs. So it's about pulling the whole mix together. Digital really important, but I cannot overemphasize enough that face-to-face and working with relevant organisations that would be associated with the type of course you're trying to promote. Okay, I definitely take that, and it's true that face-to-face probably in that culture, does have more bearing than in certain other markets that we're perhaps also very accustomed to working in. But I guess I can't really let you talk about face-to-face without really thinking about the place aspect. And Nigeria is one of those places that does cause a sharp intake of breath on occasion, and people don't always feel, not from us of course, but people don't always feel completely comfortable in travelling to the region. Any thoughts on sort of safety and security? I mean, you've just got back and you're in and out of the market every 6 weeks or whatever. How does it look on the ground? How does it feel? Sure. I think just to kick this off, I mean, let's take it back to when I first went to Nigeria 20 years ago. I was in exactly the same place. I'd heard a lot of stories. I'd heard a lot of rumours. I was a bit nervous on the plane coming into land in Lagos. And actually, in the 20 years I've been working in Nigeria, I have felt safe. I have felt secure. I've prepared for that. I've developed a network of trusted drivers, trusted hotels, trusted places to travel. But as long as you have people on the ground who put in place drivers for you, you stay in good quality hotels, you don't do anything stupid, you don't flash the cash, you don't take a lot of, you don't wear your watches, you don't wear your jewellery, then I actually find Nigeria to be not nearly as bad as some of the stories you might have heard. The only thing I would say is that there are certain areas in Nigeria, and if you look at the US travel advice or Canadian travel advice or UK, they will still say there's issues in northeast Nigeria and you should avoid them. I was looking at the US advice today, and of course it says to try and avoid the Delta regions. And that's probably good advice. We travel to some of those areas, but there's a lot of work that can still be done in cities like Abuja, Calabar, Lagos, without having to put yourself in a difficult situation. But that said, if you are prepared to travel to some of these second-tier cities where they're seen as being a little bit more difficult to move around in, as long as you have good security on the ground with companies like Halogen, for example, that we work closely with, then my experience is that it generally runs pretty smoothly.
Yeah, I guess the implication for a budget holder, though, or someone who's responsible for the market of that, is while that's really safe and sensible advice and very measured, in reality that means that Nigeria is going to be not a cheap operating market, because you're not going to be taking any shortcuts. You are going to be definitely investing in proper transportation. You're definitely going to be investing in Hilton levels of accommodation in order to have that level of kind of security outside. You know what I mean? There are times when you become very familiar with a market and you start to stay in much more kind of local and much more modest integrated hotels and kind of small places. But it just doesn't really work like that in Nigeria, does it, unfortunately?
No, it doesn't, Zoe. And I think that is an important point. Nigeria, for sure, is a country where it costs money, whether that's hotels, whether it's moving about, security, logistics. And it's not going to be a place where you'll get a quick gain out of the country and then you can maybe move on. Nigeria is sustained investment. And if you put that sustained investment in and you put a reasonable amount of money, resource and effort into the market, with the growth numbers that we've spoken about earlier on, if you have the right course portfolio, you will succeed.
Yeah, and I think, to be fair, there are very few places these days where international officers or those responsible for recruitment on the ground can just nip in, do a quick bit of activity and hope to see a return. Markets just like that just don't exist anymore. So I don't think it's unusual in that respect. But that does take me on nicely to the kind of the pricing element, and really thinking about, we've talked about the kind of cost of working there, and also about oil prices and forex. But I guess I'm interested just to get a sense of the developments in the market for students, the extent to which they're self-funded and the extent to which it's a scholarship market. And where, you know, when I think of scholarships, typically in so many markets we think of government scholarships, but in Nigeria it's not so much led by that, it's private sector, isn't it?
It is, yeah. I mean, I think it splits down into three, to be honest with you. I mean, there's the self-sponsored students, and they quite rightly have an eye on the forex market and the exchange rates, and will delay their study if they see the exchange rates fluctuating wildly. But there is a developed scholarship program in Nigeria. Now, there's government scholarships through the TET Fund, through the Niger Delta Development Commission, through the Petroleum Technology Development Fund, and there are also regional scholarships. However, with regional scholarships, I would be very, very careful, because with the new government coming in, there has been the case where a lot of students from regional states, the money has not turned up at the universities, whereas the federal funded scholarships are fairly safe and secure, and the funding is ring-fenced and guaranteed from TET Fund, NDDC. But to pick up on your point there, Zoe, there's also the international corporations, Total, Shell, Chevron, all run their own independent scholarships as well. So if you're a university and you have links to any of those companies, or you have links to companies that do work out in Nigeria, I think it's well worth speaking to your business development team or team that work with employers in the university to find out if you have any links with companies in Nigeria. Start the conversation there. I think you could be quite surprised by what you find out.
Yeah, and I guess completely. And I guess the obvious kind of continuation of that theme is just a quick audit internally of Nigeria connections, which may not be necessarily on the radar of an international office, but which may have roots in faculty or alums, you know, just looking at advancement and development functions as well, and just seeing what connections there may be there. So, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that is well worth doing is starting off speaking to your human resource department. I mean, I've found that hugely useful for clients. Just finding out, you'd be surprised how many people do have those Nigerian connections, and just doing that kind of ground level business development internally, as you suggest.
Yeah, exactly. All right, we are coming towards the second, sort of the latter stages of our 7 Ps model, and we're going to try and focus in a bit more on what optimizing that investment really looks like in a second. But just to thank you for your questions, which are just coming in now, and I'll save those up and ask Stuart all of them at the end. So just do bear with us on that front. There's a couple of quite interesting ones which are showing that some of the people on the call are definitely active already in Nigeria at the moment. So another couple more slides and we'll get to those momentarily. I guess I just wanted to, Stuart, to ask you about the people aspect and, you know, the engagement with the market and ensuring sustainability. And I guess, obviously, you and I became international officers at a time when the fly-in, fly-out model was the predominant one, but increasingly I know that local presence has definitely got a role to play. I mean, how do you see that piece working?
Yes, there's a number of pieces to it. I mean, the ideal model, Zoe, is for a university or school or college to obviously have a dedicated person within their team in their country, whether that's the US or whether that's in Canada, focusing on the Nigerian market. But it's so important now to have some form of on-the-ground presence. So whether that's working with a strategic consultant like ourselves, whether that's working through an agent and having an embedded body in their office, or whether it's having someone that is independent and autonomous working directly for your college or university based out in country, or setting up the full-blown liaison office. I mean, these are options that are being delivered on the ground. There's certainly a number of UK universities using those models now, and they realise that they need that kind of multi-channel presence. So on-the-ground presence, either via agents, having their international office in the home country staffed up to support these overseas operations, and finally involving academic staff at a time where they can really add value. So whether that's in discussions with universities out in country in Nigeria, whether that's developing partnerships, or whether that's coming out to country to give guest lectures on specific topics that these academics are specialised in. That is increasingly becoming the way.
Okay. All right. The very last thing that I want to focus on before we get to these questions is the process and practicalities of actually operating. You mentioned faculty there, and I guess there's an internal process around working in West Africa and Nigeria, particularly in terms of culturally the time frames that people make decisions on where they're going to study and how they move that on, you know, and the impact of things like exam boards. Can you just give us a very, very quick summary of that, and then we're going to get to questions?
Yeah, absolutely. I think also, just before I kick off there, Zoe, it's worth noting that the actual pipeline, the student decision-making process in Nigeria can be anything up to kind of 2 to 3 years. So any leads that you get and you don't think they're converting, don't just knock them out. There's clear evidence, and I've done a lot of research into this, that inquiries can take up to 2 to 3 years to come through. So just a point to hold there. But the practicalities, Zoe, exam dates, we're talking the academic term generally in the schooling and same in universities, generally runs from September to July. The school exam results, WIAC being the main national board, their results are normally released in August. Application deadlines, that's something that universities really need to set themselves, and they need to think about the visa process. So if you're a Canadian institution, for example, you need to be very aware that the visa could take 3 months. That's not going to be the case. That's not going to be the case in the US. However, I was having a look this morning at timelines for US visas, and the majority of students are called for interview. Now in Abuja, you can get an interview in a day, whereas in Lagos, the wait is about 11 days in Lagos. So you need to be very aware of those practicalities, because really the timescale and the pipeline is driven by the visa or the study permit process. Yeah, okay. All right. And I presume that that's what you found on the ground in terms of working with your Canadian client this year, hey? Yeah, I mean, absolutely. We knew that we had to get the applications in the pipeline for starting in the fall at a very early stage, because the visa was going to take 3 months. Now, sometimes it will be quicker than that, but those are the timescales that you kind of have to work to. Yeah, okay. Quite challenging. Well, all right, look. Sorry. No, I was just going to, a final point there, Zoe, that there's a number of institutions, and I've seen it across North America and Canada, where they're taking applications and maybe charging a small fee, maybe $100 to make the application fee, which is fine. But there's also evidence that they're not putting in place a deposit system. Now, if you don't put in place a deposit system, now we're talking generally here, maybe somewhere between $2,000 and $4,000 US dollars would be an appropriate level. If you don't put that in, it will be very difficult to work out what your conversion rates will be like. And although your application pool might look good, if you're not taking deposits from students, I think you'll find that the actual conversion at the end of the day will be very low. A deposit is a commitment, and it shows the student or the sponsor or the parents have access to funds. So I would strongly encourage institutions to put a deposit in place.
Just to encourage a robust kind of pool of people. All right, well, look, thank you very much for that. We're close to the end of our session. We've just got a couple of minutes left, and we've got, as I said, questions coming in. So first one is from one of our people who has already engaged in the market, one of our clients on the call. What kind of strategies are schools doing with Nigerian students to ensure fee payment? Because last year's challenges resulted in major concerns over students having the capacity to pay, and I presume that's major concerns internally. So what have you seen schools and universities doing?
So I think first off to say that last year was absolutely exceptional in terms of two things. So new students struggling to get the monies transferred to pay their school fees, but more importantly, students who are actually studying with the institutions struggling to get payments from Nigeria to maintain their support and their kind of living expenses. Now, what we saw our clients having to do last year was to be flexible around that. So making sure that their access was not cut off if they were still going to pay their school fees, and if they were still in Nigeria and they weren't going to be able to get the money out of Nigeria for that year, offering them deferrals for this year. So carrying the offer forward, making them an offer for this year. And the evidence is now the ones that have deferred, we're beginning to see deposits coming in. So I think last year you had to show a little bit of flexibility. I do not see this year, from just coming back from Nigeria, that the same issues will exist as existed last year, because the whole economic and forex situation has moved on dramatically from last year.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay, so being resolved, hopefully not an issue. All right. Second question, are universities having any challenges with very underage students who present themselves having met admissions requirements, but they're only 14 or 15? And actually, this definitely chimes with my experience on the ground when I worked in an institution. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's really interesting because I had exactly this situation on the ground when I was out there the last time with my Canadian client. So what's happening in Nigeria is that they've tried to introduce a system for very bright students to progress very quickly onto the WAEC exam. So you will absolutely come across students who will only be 14, 15 and could well have their final WAEC results at a good level. So there's nothing to say that those will be fake results or there will be any problem with them. The challenge you will have as institutions, and my clients have exactly the same challenge, is over the guardianship and whether you can legally admit them at that point. And how is that being resolved?
How is that being resolved?
It's very difficult, Zoe. So our client, for example, in Canada, they have a guardianship scheme where they can put the student in touch with a guardian. But at the age of 14, 15, that's still going to be impractical. And a lot of them are saying you are just going to have to wait because it opens up a can of worms, to be honest with you. Every institution will have different policies around it. Generally in the UK, for example, they need to be a minimum of 16 years of age before they can even take guardianship.
Yeah, I just think Nigeria is the only country I've worked in, and I've worked in many a market where you get this. And I think quite apart from the sort of legal responsibilities, there's a real social element to it as well. Imagine having someone who's that young within the social structure of a full university campus. It just doesn't feel right at all. So general agreement on that, and I think it is quite common in Nigeria and not necessarily set to reduce at all.
No, it's not. But just to finish that off, so I mean, if a student has contacted the university or made an application, they've obviously demonstrated they've done their research, their interest, just keep them warm as an institution. Keep in contact with them. Nigerians, by nature, will wait, and that student could well wait 2 or 3 years. As long as you keep them warm and keep them informed and keep them engaged, then they could well come to you in 2-3 years' time. As
long as they've paid your deposit. That's,
as long as
Yeah, paid the deposit, yeah. All right, quick, a couple of very last quick ones. We've got a question about spend, similar to one I asked earlier actually. What rough proportion of, how would you split spend between face-to-face and digital? And connected to that, another one, if I set up a local office on the ground, does that mean I don't have to travel to Nigeria? Stuart? Nope, we've lost him. Okay, well, that question, I'm sorry, we'll have to hold over to a future event. But thank you very much for joining us. And as you will have sensed, we've had one or two technical issues today, which we've been trying to counter as best we can. But thank you for bearing with us. We hope it was useful. And thank you, Stuart, for joining us today. The recording will be available shortly. And if anybody wants to follow up directly and have a one-to-one conversation, perhaps you'd just like to chat a bit more, if you're grappling with a particular issue, we'd be very happy to be in touch. So do feel free to drop us a line, and I'll be in touch with the recording in the next couple of days. Thanks so much, and have a very good rest of the day. Bye-bye.